The marble floors of the Harrington Country Club had seen a great many entrances, men in hand-stitched Italian loafers, women draped in silk the color of champagne, old money arriving with the quiet confidence of those who had never once doubted their place in the world. The chandeliers overhead, each one imported from a workshop in Vienna and hung with surgical precision, cast the kind of warm golden light that made everyone inside look slightly more beautiful than they actually were. Portraits of founding members lined the east wall, their painted eyes staring out with the placid certainty of men who had built something and intended it to last. On the afternoon in question, the lobby smelled faintly of cedar, fresh-cut flowers, and the ghost of expensive cologne, a scent that, over the decades, had come to mean one thing above all others: you have arrived. But for one man walking through the front door that day, the scent carried no such message. For Ethan Cole, it smelled only of a memory he had spent years learning to carry quietly. There were, as there always are in places built on the idea of exclusivity, unspoken rules at the Harrington rules about clothing and comportment, about the angle of a chin and the firmness of a handshake, about what kind of confidence was recognized as legitimate, and what kind was merely aspiration wearing the wrong shoes. Ethan Cole, on that particular spring afternoon, violated every single one of them simply by existing in the room. And he was entirely unaware of it, which was perhaps the most subversive thing about him. He was 45 years old, though he wore it the way men wear age when life has tested them fully, not with the softness of comfort, but with the particular stillness of someone who had passed through fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. His jacket was a faded navy, clean but clearly not tailored, the kind of garment chosen for warmth rather than impression. His shoes were worn at the heels in a way that spoke of long roads traveled, not neglect. He had come directly from a 3-week volunteer trip to a rural medical outreach program in the Southwest, and he had not thought to stop home first. There had been no reason to. He had received the invitation that morning by phone. An old friend, he was told, had arranged a seat at the table for a private luncheon, and he had said yes, the way he said yes to most things now, without ceremony, without calculation, simply because someone had asked. He carried nothing but a small leather notebook, worn smooth at the corners, and a pen tucked behind his ear. He looked, in the plainest terms, like a man who did not belong. He had not always looked this way. There had been a time, not so distant as to be mythological, yet far enough that it lived in him the way old music lives, as feeling rather than fact, when Ethan Cole had moved through rooms like this one with ease. He had built a logistics company from a single leased truck and a borrowed office in a strip mall in Cleveland. And by the time he was 35, that company employed over 800 people and operated across 14 states. He had been photographed for the cover of a regional business magazine once, standing in front of the fleet with his sleeves rolled up, grinning the grin of a man who genuinely could not believe his luck. The divorce had come first, a slow unraveling rather than a sudden break. Two people who had grown in such different directions that one morning they woke up and found they were strangers sharing a house. The bankruptcy had come next, not from recklessness, but from a perfect storm of bad timing. A partner who turned out to be neither honest nor loyal, and a market that shifted beneath his feet before he could find new ground. He had lost the company, the house, the accounts, the car. He had kept his son, James, now 23, and living his own life on the West Coast. He had kept his health. He had kept, somehow, the particular quality that had always defined him, the quiet, unshakable conviction that what a man does for others, when no one is looking and nothing is owed, is the only measure of him that truly counts. The lobby opened into a wide, sun-filled atrium where clusters of the city's most powerful people stood holding crystal glasses and speaking in the low, assured tones of those accustomed to being listened to. Ethan paused just inside the entrance, taking in the room the way he always took in rooms, not nervously, but observantly, as though committing a landscape to memory. A few heads turned. A woman in a cream blazer glanced at his shoes and then looked away. Two men near the bar exchanged a look that needed no translation. Ethan did not flinch. He had been looked at this way before. and he understood that the look said more about the person giving it than the one receiving it. He moved toward the reception desk at the far end of the lobby, where a young woman in a black blazer was checking names against a list on a silver clipboard. He gave his name. She looked, searched, looked again. He waited, and it was then that he heard the footsteps, sharp, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had long ago decided that authority was something you performed before you exercised it. Richard Holt was the kind of man who had arrived at his position through a precise combination of ambition, social fluency, and an instinct for knowing which rooms to be in and which people to stand near. He was 51, trim in his dark suit, with silver hair combed back in a way that communicated competence without warmth. He had managed the Harrington for 9 years, and in those 9 years he had developed what he considered an infallible eye. One that could size up a guest in the time it took to cross a marble floor, and categorize them with a confidence he mistook for discernment. He saw Ethan from across the lobby, and what he saw was a calculation he had already completed before he reached the man. He stepped in front of the reception desk, positioning himself squarely between Ethan and the rest of the room, and he spoke with the particular volume of a man who wants an audience without appearing to want one. "Excuse me," his voice carried. Several nearby conversations paused. "Are you a member here?" He said it the way a customs officer might say it, not as a question, but as a verdict being confirmed. Ethan looked at him evenly. "I was invited as a guest," Ethan said. "A friend arranged it." Richard's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. "A guest," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it wanting. He glanced at Ethan's jacket, his shoes, his worn notebook. "By whom?" Ethan gave the name. Richard paused for a beat that was a fraction too long to be professional, then turned to the young woman at the desk and said something in a low voice. She checked again. The name was there. It was clearly there. But Richard turned back to Ethan with the expression of a man who has decided that paperwork is not the point. "Sir," he said. And the room had grown quieter now, in that particular way that rooms grow quiet when they sense something uncomfortable approaching. "We have a dress code here." "Standards. I'm not sure this is," he gestured vaguely, taking in the entirety of Ethan, with a single motion, "the appropriate setting for you." He paused for effect, and then he said it plainly, loudly enough for the nearest 30 people to hear without any question. "People like you don't belong here." The words landed in the lobby the way a stone lands in still water, with a sharp, immediate impact followed by ripples that reached every corner of the room. Laughter, or something close enough to laughter to be indistinguishable, came from 2 men near the fireplace. A woman turned away, studying the portrait on the wall with sudden great interest. The young woman at the reception desk dropped her gaze to the clipboard. And Ethan Cole stood very still, the way a man stands still when he has been through worse and survived it. And he looked at Richard Holt with eyes that held no anger, no humiliation, no urgency to defend himself. He simply looked at him, and then, quietly, he nodded, as if acknowledging something he had already known was possible, and he turned and began to walk toward the door. Richard watched him go with the small, satisfied posture of a man who has protected something he valued from something he could not name. Behind him, the room shifted back toward its conversations. He believed, in that moment, that the matter was settled. He was wrong in a way he would spend the rest of the day, and perhaps many days after, understanding fully. What Richard could not have known, as he stood watching Ethan's back recede toward the entrance, was what was happening in the minds of the men and women seated in the dining hall beyond the atrium. He could not have known, because he had never thought to ask, that the Harrington's most powerful members were not simply wealthy. They were people who had, each in their own private history, been helped. Not by institutions, not by programs, not by the kind of help that comes with press releases and plaques. Helped by a man. A specific man. A man who had appeared at the right moment, asked nothing in return, and then quietly stepped back into whatever life he was living, and never mentioned it again. Richard could not have known this because the man in question had never told anyone, had never leveraged the goodwill, had never appeared at events held in rooms like this one, to collect the social currency his generosity had earned him. Ethan Cole had simply done what he did, and moved on. And so, as he walked toward the door that afternoon, 37 years of quiet, unannounced, unrewarded decency were following him across the marble floor, and they were about to announce themselves. The sound came first, not a voice, but a physical sound, the low scrape of a chair being pushed back against marble. Then another, then a third. Ethan slowed without stopping. He did not look back. The scraping continued, one after another, like a percussion instrument finding its rhythm, until the sound of it filled the lobby and the atrium beyond it, with something that could only be described as deliberate. He stopped walking. The room was not quiet now, it was doing something else, something between anticipation and reckoning. That kind of silence that isn't empty but full, pressing outward from every wall. And then, from the far end of the dining hall, a voice broke through it. A man's voice, measured and certain, carrying without effort the weight of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms full of people who didn't want to hear him. "Richard," the voice said. And the name alone was enough to change the temperature in the room. "I think you just made the biggest mistake of your career." Dr. Graham Harrison was 64 years old, a cardiologist of considerable reputation whose name appeared on the boards of 4 hospitals and 2 research foundations. He had silver hair, broad shoulders, and the kind of face that communicated, without effort, that he had seen life at its most fragile and had not looked away. He stood at his table in the dining hall, and he stood the way people stand when they are not performing outrage, but have simply decided that something must be said, and they are the one to say it. The room was watching him. Richard Holt had turned, and Harrison looked not at Richard but at Ethan, who had turned back to face the room, and there was something in Harrison's expression that was softer than his reputation would have suggested, something that looked, if one were paying close attention, like the particular relief of a man who has waited a long time to say something true out loud. 11 years ago, Harrison said, and the dining hall was absolutely still, I was running a cancer treatment center on the south side of this city. We were 3 months from closing. The funding had dried up, the board was fracturing, and I had 700 active patients who were going to lose their care. He paused. A man I barely knew at the time called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked me to walk him through what we needed. Not what I wanted, what we needed. He listened for 2 hours. And the following Monday, the funding arrived anonymously. No conditions, no strings, no naming rights, no seats on the board. Harrison looked at Richard now, and his voice was unhurried. That man kept 300 families from bankruptcy. He kept those 700 patients in treatment. He never told a single person he had done it. I only know because a mutual accountant made an error I was never supposed to see corrected. He looked at Ethan again. His name is Ethan Cole, and you just asked him to leave your building. The dining hall absorbed this, the way a room absorbs something it didn't expect, not with noise but with a particular quality of attention. A sharpening of focus that has no sound. Richard opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried something that was meant to be authority and came out as uncertainty. These are claims that, but before the sentence could find its footing, another chair scraped back, and the second person rose. Margaret Okonkwo was 58, president of the city's largest community bank. A woman whose name appeared on the short list whenever positions of civic leadership came available, and who was known, among those who knew her well, for a precision of character that matched her precision of speech. She stood without urgency, without theater. The way a person stands when the truth is simply what it is, and they are done with waiting for the right moment. I met Ethan Cole 17 years ago, she said. When I was 31 years old and trying to secure a loan for a neighborhood development project that every other institution in this city had turned down flat. My credit was thin, my collateral was limited. My vision, I was told repeatedly, was too ambitious. Ethan was not in lending. He had no formal reason to be involved, but he spent 4 weekends walking through the neighborhood with me, learning the numbers, asking questions no one else had asked. And then he personally co-signed a commitment that gave my project the credibility it needed to get funded. She looked around the room. That project became the Morrison Corridor Development, 2,000 residents, 12 businesses, a school that now has a wait list. She looked at Richard with a steadiness that carried no malice, only weight. I have never forgotten what he did, and I will never pretend I didn't see what just happened in this lobby. Another chair, this time it was Judge Elliot Warren, retired, who had presided over the federal district court for 20 years, and whose opinion on matters of conduct carried a specific gravity that needed no amplification. He was 71, compact, with the watchful eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades weighing the truth of what people said against the truth of who they were. He stood slowly, as though the act itself were a ruling. "I won't tell a long story," he said, and the brevity of it somehow made the room lean in rather than relax. "When my son was 23, he made a mistake that could have ended his career before it started. The kind of mistake young men make when they are proud and afraid in equal measure and don't know how to ask for help. Ethan Cole found out, and I still don't know how. And he connected my son with an attorney, a mentor, and a second chance before I even knew there was a problem. My son is now a surgeon. He has never known that the hand that opened the door for him belonged to a man in a faded jacket who was standing in this lobby 20 minutes ago." He sat down. He did not add anything. He didn't need to. From the far corner of the room, Professor Diana Ashworth rose, head of the economics department at the city's flagship university, author of 3 books on institutional equity, and a woman who, as those near her would later recall, had been white-knuckling her napkin since the moment Richard Holt had raised his voice. "Ethan Cole taught a seminar at my university 8 years ago," she said, "for a group of first-generation graduate students who had never had access to a working business leader willing to spend real time with them. He didn't lecture. He stayed for 5 hours. He answered every question. He gave every one of those 12 students his personal contact information and told them to use it." She looked at the room. 7 of those 12 students now run their own organizations. 3 of them are here in this city, building things, and none of them know because he never told them, and they were too young to look closely enough that the man who spent that afternoon with them was living in a 2-bedroom apartment at the time because he had given away most of what he had left. She paused. "He didn't tell them because it wasn't the point. That's who he is." The room was no longer quiet in the way it had been before. It was loud now with the particular noise of people recalibrating low conversations, the sound of realization moving through a crowd, the small adjustments people make when the map they had of a situation turns out to be the wrong map entirely. Richard Holt stood at the center of it all, and the careful architecture of his authority was doing something he had not designed it to do. It was becoming visible. When authority is real, it doesn't become visible under scrutiny, it deepens. What becomes visible is the scaffolding. And Richard was beginning to see, from the way people were looking at him, that what he had mistaken for authority was scaffolding all the way down. He looked for something to hold on to, and found none of the usual handholds, no institutional backing, no social consensus, no one in the room willing to give him the small nod that would signal shared understanding. He was alone in the middle of a room full of people who were, one by one, deciding that they were done. Upstairs, in the private meeting room on the 2nd floor, a woman had heard the growing sound of the lobby below and had pushed back her chair. Victoria Sinclair was 44 years old, and she was, by nearly any measure applied to the business world, extraordinary. Her company VSC Global, which she had built from a 3-person consulting firm into an international infrastructure conglomerate valued at over $2 billion, was the kind of success story that business schools used as a case study and rivals used as a measuring stick. She was tall, composed, dressed with the kind of precision that is more about intention than expense, and she moved through rooms with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have learned that every gesture costs something and should therefore mean something. She had come to the Harrington that afternoon for a quarterly board meeting that was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock, and she had been reviewing documents in the upstairs room when the sound from below had reached her, not loud enough to alarm, but persistent enough to pull. She stood at the top of the staircase now, looking down into the lobby, and she saw the back of a man in a faded navy jacket standing very still, and before she had processed a single piece of information about the scene, something in her went entirely quiet, in the way that only happens when a person encounters something their body recognizes before their mind has caught up. She came down the stairs at a pace that said she was not rushing toward something but moving toward it with complete intention, and when she reached the lobby floor and turned so that she could see his face, the quiet in her deepened to something that was almost weightless. It was him. 20 years older than the last time she had seen him properly, the lines around his eyes deeper, the hair more gray than brown, but the expression, the particular stillness of his expression, the way he occupied space without claiming it was exactly as she remembered. She looked at Richard Holt. He saw her, and seemed, immediately and visibly, to recalibrate. In his experience, Victoria Sinclair's presence resolved disputes. She had authority, discretion, and the kind of social intelligence that, he believed, would allow her to see the situation for what he had decided it was. He began to speak, his words arranging themselves into a version of events that cast him as reasonable and careful and responsible for the standards of a fine institution. Victoria let him finish. She gave him the full, courteous attention of someone who understands that people need to say what they need to say before they can hear what is true, and when he was done, she turned to look at Ethan, and the expression on her face was not readable to anyone in the room except, perhaps, Ethan himself. "Richard," she said, and her voice was not raised, was in fact softer than anyone had expected, which made it, paradoxically, the loudest thing in the room. "Do you have any idea who you just spoke to?" She did not wait for an answer. She looked at the room, at the members who had stood and spoken, at those still seated and listening, at the young woman at the reception desk, who had long since set down her clipboard, at Richard Holt, whose confident posture had developed, over the last 15 minutes, the quality of a building subsiding. And then she looked at Ethan, who was watching her with the expression of someone who would very much prefer to be having this conversation somewhere else, or perhaps not at all. And she smiled, briefly and privately, the smile of someone who has known someone well enough to predict them. "I was 23 years old," she said. "I was a junior intern at an investment firm that I had fought for 2 years to get into, and I had made an error in a client presentation, the kind of error that isn't catastrophic, unless the wrong person decides to make it catastrophic. The managing director at the time was the kind of man who liked deciding that things were catastrophic. He called me into his office on a Friday afternoon and told me that he was recommending my termination and that I should not expect a reference." She paused. "I walked out of that building with my badge in my hand, and I sat down on the steps outside, and I didn't know what to do. I had student loans. I had a family counting on me. I had just been told that my mistake was going to define me." Her voice was even, unhurried, entirely without performance. "Ethan Cole walked past me on those steps. He didn't know me. I had never spoken to him. He sat down beside me, and he asked me what happened. Not with pity, with genuine interest, the way you ask someone a question because the answer actually matters to you. I told him everything. And then he told me that what he had just heard was a story about a capable person in the wrong environment, not a story about failure." She looked at Ethan, who was looking at the floor now with the expression of a man who would accept a great many things more comfortably than being praised. He called a colleague of his that weekend. He made an introduction. He wrote a letter that he never told me about, that I only found out about years later. He gave me the first real chance I had ever been given by someone who had nothing to gain from giving it. She looked at the room again. "My company did $1.8 billion in revenue last year. And every year, on the anniversary of the day, I sat on those steps. I remind myself where I would be if a stranger hadn't decided to stop. The dining hall was absolutely still. Someone no one later remembered who had set down a glass that made the faintest sound, and it seemed to echo. Richard Holt was no longer standing with any of the postures he had arrived with. He looked like a man caught not in a lie, but in something worse, a fundamental error of judgment, the kind that cannot be walked back because everyone in the room has witnessed both the error and the evidence against it simultaneously. Ethan, for his part, had looked up from the floor, and was looking at Victoria with something that was not embarrassment, exactly, but the close cousin of it. The discomfort of a private person being made briefly, undeniably public. He shook his head slightly. Victoria, who had expected this, did not stop. "There's something else," she said. And she said it to the room at large now. To the members, and the standing figures, and the managers near the back, and the staff who had quietly gathered in doorways. Something that most of you in this room don't know, and that Ethan has never told anyone. She paused, in the way that people pause when they are about to offer something real. 15 years ago, this club was in financial ruin. The words settled differently than the others had. Among the senior members, those who had been here long enough to know the version of the story that was passed around in careful, partial whispers, a particular quality of attention took hold. Among the newer members, there was simply the recognition that something significant was being said. Victoria looked at no one in particular as she spoke. The original ownership structure had been defaulted on. The debt load was unsustainable. The board at the time had been told, in writing, by 2 separate financial consultants, that the Harrington Country Club would cease operations within 18 months unless a private investor stepped in and restructured the entire debt. She paused. One did. A single investor, private, anonymous, who asked for no naming rights, no board representation, no return beyond a market rate that he subsequently declined. He restructured the debt, absorbed the shortfall, and funded the renovation of the West Wing that all of you use every week. She looked at Richard now, and her gaze was not unkind, but it was final. The condition he attached was that the names of the investors never be disclosed, because he did not want the gesture to become political inside the membership. He simply wanted the staff, the 312 people employed here at the time, to keep their jobs. She looked at Ethan. That investor was Ethan Cole. The silence that followed was of a specific and unusual kind. It was not the silence of shock, exactly. Though shock was present, it was the silence of a room full of people simultaneously renegotiating the terms of a story they thought they already knew. Members who had passed through this lobby 100 times, who had eaten at these tables, and played on these courts and conducted business in these rooms, were realizing, in the span of a few seconds, that the floor beneath their feet had been steadied by a man they had just watched being publicly humiliated at the door. The weight of that realization moved through the room differently for different people. For some, it was simply astonishment. For others, particularly those who had been sitting near enough to hear Richard's original words, who had smirked or looked away or found the nearby portrait suddenly absorbing, it was something more corrosive. The recognition of their own smallness in the moment, the awareness that they had participated, through silence or amusement, in something that had turned out to be its precise opposite of what it appeared. Richard Holt stood in the center of all of it, and he was no longer performing anything. The scaffolding was gone. What remained was a man confronting, with full clarity, the consequences of certainty applied without understanding. It was a moment of complete defeat, and it had arrived with the particular efficiency of the truth. Without argument, without confrontation, simply by being said clearly in a room of people with enough honesty to hear it. Richard looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him without triumph, without cruelty, without the expression of a man who has won something. He looked at him with the expression of a person who has been where Richard currently is, in the stripped down, nowhere to hide clarity of having been fundamentally wrong about something that mattered, and who has not forgotten what it felt like. And perhaps that was the most disorienting thing of all for Richard. That the man he had dismissed was the one person in the room whose face held no satisfaction. The first member to stand completely, to push back his chair and rise to his feet, was a man named Charles Whitmore, 60 years old, chairman of a regional investment group, and one of the club's longest tenured members. He stood without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. Then Margaret Okonkwo, who had already spoken, stood fully as well. Then Judge Warren. Then Professor Ashworth. Then, one by one, with the inevitability of something that has been decided before the first person moved the way a wave moves, before any single drop of water has committed to the direction the dining hall rose. Not every person rose at exactly the same moment. It was not choreographed. It was not organized. It was the thing that happens when a sufficient number of people independently reach the same conclusion at the same time and have no reason to hide it. Within 90 seconds, 214 members of the Harrington Country Club were standing. Some of them were applauding. Most of them were simply standing, which, in its own quiet way, said everything the applause said and more. The sound of it was not the sound of a crowd at an event. It was the sound of a room full of people recognizing something, together, that none of them could have articulated alone. It was the sound of decency being returned to the person it had always belonged to. Ethan did not move for a long moment. He stood in the center of all of it. The sound, the attention, the particular pressure of being seen fully by a room full of people at once, and his expression did what expressions do when they are being genuinely inhabited, rather than performed. It broke, briefly, into something unguarded and real. Not grief, not quite. Not joy. Not exactly, but the particular fragility of a person who has carried something privately for a very long time, and suddenly feels the weight redistributed by other hands, not taken from them, but shared. He looked at Victoria, and she looked at him, and the thing that passed between them was the kind of communication that exists between people who have a long history with each other. Not romance, not nostalgia, but the deeper thing, the recognition between people who have each been, at the right moment, essential to the other's survival. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the floor, and then he looked up at the room, and he nodded once, genuinely, and that nod was the only speech he offered to the moment, and it was enough. Richard Holt took 2 steps forward. He did not look like a man who was choosing this moment. He looked like a man who had run out of moments that would be better. He had, in the course of the past 45 minutes, moved through several internal territories: certainty, confusion, defensiveness, the brief refuge of procedural thinking, and finally the open ground of accountability, which is always colder and cleaner than the territories before it. He stopped in front of Ethan. He said, not loudly, in a voice that had lost every quality it had possessed when this began the performance, the authority, the projection, "Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology. What I said, and how I said it, was wrong. It was deeply wrong. I am sorry." The words were plain. They were not polished. They did not try to reframe anything or minimize anything, and the absence of those maneuvers was, itself, a form of courage, the small, late courage of a man who has been given the chance to be honest and has decided to take it. Ethan looked at him. The room looked at both of them, and the silence held everything. The original insult, the revelation, the standing, the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in the space of an hour, compressed into a few square feet of marble floor, where 2 men stood with nothing between them but the truth of what they were to each other. In that moment, one man who had caused harm, and was saying so, and one man deciding what to do with that. Ethan let the silence rest for a moment without filling it. Then he said, simply, quietly, in the voice of someone who has thought about these things for a long time, and has arrived at his conclusions not through theory but through living, a place doesn't become distinguished because of who walks through its doors. It becomes distinguished because of how the people inside it treat everyone who does. He was not looking at Richard when he said it. He was looking at no one in particular, or perhaps at everyone. He said it the way people say things that are true and have always been true and do not require performance to be communicated. The words moved through the room and settled. Richard nodded. He did not speak again. There was nothing left to add, and he seemed to understand this with a clarity that was, perhaps, the beginning of something better in him. The room absorbed the words the way rooms absorb things that are said without theatrics, but with total conviction, not immediately, but lastingly. Victoria moved to Ethan's side. She did not take his arm, or make any gesture that would add drama to a moment that had already had too much. She simply stood beside him, the way people stand beside each other when they want to communicate, without words, that they are in the same place. Around them, the room began to breathe again. Conversations resumed. People sat. The staff who had gathered in the doorways returned quietly to their stations, and the young woman at the reception desk who had been holding the silver clipboard without looking at it for the past 20 minutes, set it carefully down on the counter and exhaled. Victoria turned to the room and said, in the clear, direct way that had made her effective in every boardroom she had ever entered, that she would like to formally propose Ethan Cole as an honorary advisor to the Harrington Country Club, a ceremonial role that carried no obligations and no demands but recognized, in the institution's own name, the contribution of a man whose relationship to this place had never been properly acknowledged. The room did not deliberate. The senior members who had spoken, and several who had not, signaled their assent with the ease of people who had already arrived at the conclusion on their own. It was noted, formally, in the evening's minutes. Ethan tried to decline politely, and was met with a collective failure to hear him that had the quality of affection rather than disregard. He accepted, briefly, and without elaboration. He left the Harrington Country Club that evening, as the spring light was going amber over the city, walking out through the marble lobby alone, the same way he had walked in. His jacket was the same faded navy, his shoes were the same worn leather. He carried his notebook and his pen. If someone had seen him from a distance from across the street, or from an upstairs window, or from the steps of the building itself, they would have seen a middle-aged man in plain clothes, walking at an unhurried pace down a street lined with maples just coming into leaf. They would not have seen, could not have seen, the room he had just walked out of, the 214 people who had stood, the words that had been said and heard and would, in the weeks and months that followed, move through the city, in the way that true things move not as gossip, but as testimony, passed between people who had been there, and people who wished they had been, carried from dinner tables to boardrooms, to the quiet conversations that happen between people who are trying to understand what they believe about character and visibility, and the value of doing right when no one is watching. There is a particular quality to the aftermath of a moment that has changed something, not in the dramatic, cinematic way that stories sometimes suggest, with music and clean resolution, and everyone departing into their better selves, but in the quieter, more complicated way that actual change moves through actual people. Some of the members who had stood that afternoon left the Harrington in thoughtful silence. Others spoke in low voices on the front steps, reconstructing what they had witnessed in the way that people reconstruct important events, testing the details against memory and finding the memory accurate. A few made phone calls. A very few admitted to themselves, without sharing it, that they had been among those who smirked, or looked away, or found the portrait suddenly interesting, and that this admission was costing them something they were not sure how to name or repay. The staff moved through the dining hall with the efficiency of long practice, and the chandeliers continued their warm, impartial illumination, and the marble floor received the footsteps of departing members without comment, as marble has always done. The building did not know what had happened inside it. Only the people did, and they would carry it with them differently, each according to what they had been and what they were prepared to become. What Richard Holt thought about in the weeks that followed was, by nature, private. What is known is that he resigned from his position at the Harrington 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and that the letter of resignation made no reference to the events of that afternoon. What is also known, because people talk, and the Harrington staff, in particular, talked among themselves with the loyalty and precision of people who have watched something important, is that before he cleared his desk, he sent a handwritten note to Ethan Cole. The contents of the note were never shared publicly. Whether it was accepted, whether it changed anything, whether it was the beginning of the kind of reckoning that genuinely reshapes a person, these are questions that belong to Richard alone, and to whatever answer he was willing to live with. But the note was sent. That much is true. What Victoria Sinclair thought about is, perhaps, more knowable, because she has spoken about it since not often, but in the particular way that people speak about things that have affected them permanently, with care, with specificity, and with the quality of someone who has thought about a thing so many times that they have finally found the words that are accurate rather than impressive. She has said, in those conversations, that the thing she remembers most is not the standing, not the revelation about the club's history, not even the quiet precision of Ethan's words at the end. What she remembers is the moment she came down the stairs and saw the back of him, still, in his faded jacket, not moving, not defending himself, not doing any of the things that a person with something to prove does in the face of public diminishment. She has said that what she understood in that moment was something she had known, intellectually, for years but had never seen demonstrated so completely, that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of people who have misjudged them is simply continue being who they are, that the refusal to perform to justify, to argue, to leverage, to retaliate, is not passivity but its own kind of statement, and that statement, she has said, has more weight than anything a room full of standing people can produce, because it comes from inside rather than from the crowd. Ethan Cole did not give interviews. He did not write about the afternoon, or allow others to write about it in ways that centered him as a figure in a narrative larger than the facts. He continued his volunteer work. He continued his quiet, unannounced, unremarkable, in the best sense commitments to the organizations and people he had chosen to support over the years. He met with the 12 graduate students Victoria had connected him with a new cohort, not the original ones. And he spent an afternoon with them. That was, by all accounts, the same as the afternoon he had spent 8 years earlier. Present, unhurried, direct, and entirely unbothered by the question of what it was worth. He did not trade on the afternoon at the Harrington. He did not need to. That is not who he was. That had never been who he was. The thing about Ethan Cole, the thing that the afternoon at the Harrington illuminated, without ever meaning to, and that the people who had stood in that dining hall carried with them afterward was not his history of generosity, though that history was real and was considerable. It was not the specific facts of what he had done for Dr. Harrison's Cancer Center, or for Margaret Okonkwo's development project, or for Judge Warren's son, or for Victoria Sinclair, on a set of steps 20 years ago. Those things mattered, but they were evidence of something more foundational, and the more foundational thing was this: that Ethan Cole had arrived at a way of living in which the accumulation of external validation, wealth, recognition, status, the particular approval of rooms like the Harrington's marble lobby, had ceased to be the point. Not because he had become indifferent to the world, but because he had decided, at some point in the years of loss and rebuilding, that the only thing genuinely worth building was a person that he could recognize when he looked in the mirror, and that the mirror test had nothing to do with what was in his bank account, or whose company he kept, or what a country club manager said about his shoes. The dignity that Richard Holt had tried to remove from him that afternoon had never been Richard's to remove. That was the thing the room eventually understood. That was the thing that made them stand. That night, in the amber-lit quiet of a spring evening, Ethan Cole arrived at the Harrington Country Club as the man who, by every visible measure, did not belong. He left as the person that every member in that room, if pressed in the honest hour before sleep, would admit they had most wanted to be the person who had built something real, given it away without keeping score, and walked back into the world each morning carrying nothing heavier than the knowledge that he had done what he could with what he had, and that this, quietly and without question, was enough. He left as the one person everyone in the building had simultaneously, without conferring, come to the same its portraits, its dress codes, its standards. It had been built, in part, on the generosity of a man in a faded jacket, and that without him, and without people like him, there was no building worth entering. He turned left onto the maple-lined street. The light was going. The city carried on its evening in the way that cities do, indifferent to the interior lives of the people moving through it, to the small upheavals and quiet reckonings happening in lobbies and dining halls, and on the steps of buildings everywhere, simultaneously and without fanfare. The maples overhead were new in their leaves, that particular yellow-green of early spring that is almost luminous, almost too much, before the season, deepens it into the ordinary green of summer. Ethan walked beneath them, and did not think about the afternoon in the way that people sometimes think about their own vindication, with relish, with relief, with the particular pleasure of a score finally settled. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, straight through to the other side, noting what was true and what could be released, and then setting it down. He had other things to do. There were people he needed to call. There was a letter he needed to finish, for a foundation he had been advising, anonymously, for 3 years. There was a conversation he had promised to have with a young woman who was trying to start something important and needed someone to tell her that her instincts were sound. These things were waiting. The afternoon at the Harrington was already becoming what everything eventually becomes for people like Ethan Cole. Not a story to be told, but a thing that happened on the way to the next thing that needed doing. Somewhere behind him, in a dining hall where 214 chairs had been pushed back from their tables, the staff was clearing the last of the afternoon service, and at least one of them, the young woman at the reception desk, who had put down her clipboard and exhaled, was thinking about something she had witnessed and would think about for a long time, not because it was dramatic, though it had been, but because it was true, the kind of true that doesn't need to be repeated to continue being real. The kind that simply lives in a person, doing its work.